The Problem with Inadequately Reviewed Fringe Science by Mark Boslough from the online columns at skepticalinquirer.org. Skeptics usually recognize pseudoscience when we see it. Our heuristics include an assessment of the qualifications and reputations of an idea's proponents and whether the idea has been peer-reviewed. Fringe claims sometimes do make it into peer-reviewed publications as a result of flaws in the system. An example is cold fusion, which would not otherwise have been taken seriously. Nevertheless, it did not fool most experts. Physicist Stephen Koonin, at a 1989 American Physical Society meeting, declared, "We are suffering from the incompetence and perhaps delusion of doctors Pons and Fleischmann." He held off on speculating about other possibilities, such as dishonesty, ego, fraud, money, or politics. Even Koonin, who lacks expertise in climate science, has fallen prey to malarkey published by global warming deniers. He and two such contrarians, John Cresty and Roy Spencer, were recently rewarded for their vocal stance with positions in the Trump administration. They are not immune to the exact criticism, spoken or implied, that Koonin leveled against Pons and Fleischmann. My own research topic, the physics of planetary impacts and airbursts, has also been the subject of inadequately reviewed literature. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, YDIH, claims that the impact of a swarm of comet fragments about 12,900 years ago caused an abrupt climate shift, massive burning, and extinction. It is associated with catastrophist pseudoscience, according to David Morrison, 2010, and described as pathological science, by Clark R. Chapman, Morrison, and Alan W. Harris, 2025. Jay Melosh, who literally wrote the book on impact cratering, compared it to the Piltdown hoax. Like cold fusion and climate denial, the YDIH is rejected by virtually all experts. But reports of its death might be exaggerated. It appeals to segments of the public that subscribe to the conspiratorial notion of a mainstream narrative that is propped up by a scientific establishment. It has been comprehensively refuted, but continues to be promoted by fringe science influencers and celebrities, such as Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock. Also, like with cold fusion and climate denial, scientists who lack relevant subject matter expertise have been tricked by the YDIH. Otherwise, it is unlikely that anything related to the YDIH would have been published anywhere other than the 2006 New Age book Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes, released by publisher Inner Traditions, which focuses on astrology, alternative medicine, and other branches of pseudoscience. Once the authors of COCC recruited James Kennett, a paleoclimatologist and member of the National Academy, they had access to the PAL review track of publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. Kennett found a willing personal editor, paleontologist Stephen Stanley, who told a Nature reporter that "it's my view that I should help to get this stuff published," and expressed his personal incredulity that people can be so negative. Geologist and former university president James Powell was also enlisted by Kennett. Powell first wrote about it in his 2015 book, Four Revolutions in the Earth Sciences, where he elevated it to the status of past heresies, such as continental drift and global warming. His problem is hindsight bias, which is akin to betting on the winning horse after the race is over. A decade later, Powell appears unable to admit that his YDIH horse never made it out of the gate. Red flags about the YDIH were already present by the time Powell learned about it. The originator of the hypothesis and collector of most of the evidence, Alan West, had been convicted of fraud, represented himself without documentation as having a PhD, and published data based on samples that he knew were contaminated. Powell doubled down with another book in 2020 and an absurd accusation in 2022 that the YDIH was the victim of premature rejection by specialists in fields such as impact physics and planetary science that most of the YDIH proponents had never bothered to master, but were attempting to revolutionize. Later that year, Powell objected to my Skeptical Inquirer article that revealed falsification of evidence and other serious problems with a now retracted paper published in Scientific Reports claiming that biblical Sodom had been destroyed by a cosmic airburst. Sodom meteor strike claims should be taken with a pillar of salt, Powell wrote, violates nearly every tenet of proper skepticism as defined by Sci-Cop and CSI. He quoted Carl Sagan, who said ad hominem arguments are irrelevant. Powell failed to understand that the logical corollary of Sagan's axiom is that, if it's relevant to the argument, it's not ad hominem. Name-calling and smear campaigns against critics of the YDIH didn't start with Powell. I debated Ted Bunch and Alan West, lead author and corresponding author of the Sodom paper, respectively, about the YDIH at an archaeology conference in 2008. I was joined by Carolyn Shoemaker, discoverer of Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 and widow of Gene Shoemaker, whose pioneering impact research paved the way for the paradigm-shifting Alvarez hypothesis that the dinosaurs had been wiped out by an asteroid. Bunch referred to us as the cynical side of the debate. West and his associates now call their critics the impact mafia and describe us with words such as crazy, unhinged, and retarded. I attempted to explain the physics of airbursts to Bunch and West. My airburst models were based on simulations that have been validated by successful predictions of the observable phenomena resulting from the impact of Carolyn Shoemaker's comet. In his introduction, the debate moderator told the audience that my airburst simulations had been prominently featured in that month's issue of National Geographic. A few years later, Bunch and West published a Powell-reviewed paper on airbursts as the explanation for some glass that they considered unusual. They did not cite any physics-based models by me or anyone else, even to explain why they rejected this well-established approach and understanding. They also failed to disclose the fact that they had already been told by the geologist they were working with that at least some of their glass was railroad slag collected from an abandoned railbed. It has now emerged that many of their other samples had also been found on or near historic railbeds. It is unclear exactly how Bunch and West got involved with Stephen Collins, who first proposed that Tal el Hammam, an archaeological site in Jordan, was the biblical Sodom. Collins's suggested location was just the latest in a long list of places proposed by other self-styled biblical explorers. The vicinity of the Dead Sea is littered with ruins of the various Sodom candidates, and the biblical explorers have been engaged in contentious debates for decades, with insults, name-calling, and credential challenging that seems pervasive in Collins's avocation. I learned about the Tal el Hammam dig shortly after the broadcast in 2006 of a documentary featuring my airburst models as an explanation for the mysterious Libyan desert glass in Egypt. A coworker told me that her husband was working on an excavation for an Albuquerque Bible school, and they had found something that looked like trinitite. I referred her to a colleague who had also found unexplained glass in the Middle East. She emailed me with a CC to Collins to let me know he was the dig director. Collins never contacted me, and I forgot all about it until 2013, when I was invited by the History Channel to participate in a documentary about Collins's claims. I declined after discovering that his university was actually an unaccredited diploma mill. Also in 2013, PNS finally reformed its review practices and put Jay Malosh in charge of papers involving the YDIH. This closed the Powell review loophole and forced the authors to shop for another journal. Alan West, portraying himself as a PhD scientist, eventually got onto the editorial board of Scientific Reports. The YDIH group turned to that journal and published 3 papers there, claiming that ancient settlements had been destroyed by airbursts. 2 of them have been retracted so far, and that pathway to publication without proper review has now been closed. They recently created a vanity journal, Airbursts and Cratering Impacts, where they self-edit, self-review, and republish versions of their own retracted papers and manuscripts that have repeatedly been rejected by legitimate journals. Qualifications, competence, objectivity, and honesty are critical attributes for researchers and are relevant for assessing their work. Misconduct, incompetence, bias, misrepresentation, and data tampering should not be swept under the rug for fear of being falsely accused of ad hominem by individuals engaged in smear campaigns against mainstream scientists. The Sodom airburst paper, with fatal problems that were first pointed out in the pages of SI, was retracted in April. I predict that the scrutiny their papers are now receiving will lead to more retractions. Thank you for listening to Skeptical Inquirer Audio Edition. This podcast is produced by the Center for Inquiry at our headquarters in Amherst, New York. If you would like to support our work, please consider subscribing to Skeptical Inquirer magazine at skepticalinquirer.org. It is listeners like you that make our work possible. With your support, we can continue to promote science, reason, and secular values throughout the world. Thank you.